I'm Austin Wintory, and I'm a composer who does games and films and all kinds of other things. Being a composer in the 21st century is the best time period for that line of work of all history, because you have every single genre and medium that composers have worked in historically, writing symphonies, string quartets, operas, all the rest of it, and 10,000 new ones, whether it's video games, which itself is an umbrella term. It can mean anything from Clash Royale mobile titles up to gigantic budget AAA console titles or whatnot, and everything in between. There's, of course, film, there's television, and television itself is this exploding concept that doesn't really mean one thing anymore either. And just because of the internet, you can also just kind of dream up whatever you want. And I could just make videos of myself playing piano and figure out cool ways to shoot it and create an audience on YouTube through Instagram and Twitter and the rest of it and things like that. And so it's like the world has become this very flexible piece of dough that we can shape to be essentially whatever we want as artists. And I don't think there's any time period that can hold a remote torch to that prior to today. Because of the fact that the tools have become so democratized, which I think enhances creativity, it also greatly widens the playing field. And so in order to get paid for it, you have to stand out all the more. You have to be more uniquely you. So for composers just getting into the business, the advice I always have to offer is not about gear or about meetings or what conventions to go to or any of that kind of stuff. It's figuring out what makes you you in this very authentic way and embrace that to the point that you're actually divisive amongst audience members. It goes against our survival instinct as aspiring composers to potentially turn people off by making such stark creative choices that we know it will be kind of offensive to some. But it won't be offensive to everybody, and those it's not, it'll be like a magnet. And even if it's one person, I think that's a better way to do your career than to join the kind of endless sea of generic, faceless, personalityless music that exists out there. Because a lot of that, I think, is written from a place of fear. And so try to get over your fear and just be you, which I know is easier said than done, but all the composers I admire most, that's the one thing they all seem to have in common. The criteria for a new project is threefold, but it's really primarily between the first two, which is who am I working with? So it doesn't matter to me what the game is in terms of genre, medium, console release, that kind of thing. None of that matters to me compared to who it is. There are certain people that I would go over a cliff for them because we've been in the trenches together. That game company is a great example where we did Flow, and then of course this incredible experience together on Journey was life-changing, both during and afterward. And so it's, for them, they say jump, I say how high, that kind of thing. That matters to me far more than any other. And so most of the times when I work with someone, it's immediately about the chemistry of the collaborators, because you bleed together. That's the thing, it's so deeply collaborative. There's so much about the openness of their ideas and their openness to my ideas that matters the most. And then the second criteria would be the musical opportunity. Is it give me a chance to do something I've never done before? Now, if it's somebody I've worked with and I love them, that becomes less important to me. But if it's a new relationship, then that's the first thing I look to. What can I do that feels fresh? Then only once you've got all that figured out do I start thinking about the basics of how does it pay, what's the schedule, that kind of thing. But the first two matter so much more to me. One of the most exciting things about writing music for games is the feeling of being on the frontier of an entirely new form of artistic expression. Because the thing is, interactive media gives you this variable to contend with, that film and radio and theater and opera and all the rest of that, they're all linear. They don't have this. The non-linearity of games, to me, is as novel as imagining being a composer 100 years ago and saying, hey, it turns out we don't just have to be in the room, we can record this. And what if we don't just think of recording sessions as documentaries of the event of the performance, but we start trying to create something that would be almost hyper-real, where the microphone gets in closer than any audience member ever could, or we position it in ways, and suddenly recording becomes its own art form that completely and totally changes music for all time. The last time there was that big of a paradigm shift was recording, as today. Games, to me, shake things up as much or more than that did. So I think we have no idea where this is going, and we are all blindly fumbling in the dark, and it's awesome. My ultimate hero is Jerry Goldsmith. And what I loved about Jerry was he was insanely prolific. He was like Bach. Bach had to write one mass each week, it's just the sheer amount. But he was a working composer. That was the idea. This was the gig. Jerry felt the same way about movies. You know, movie shows up and he just says, hey, when do you need it done? I'm going to have it done. My agent used to represent him and called him a blue-collar genius because Jerry's mentality was just, I like to work and this is a job and it's like being a carpenter or any other. But the thing was, it's like being the world's greatest carpenter if you're Jerry Goldsmith, because as much as he thought of it as being very workmanlike or purely about craft, he was this incredible artist. So as a result, he was deeply chameleonic. His music ran every genre you could possibly imagine. And yet, when you study his work, you realize below that surface of genre conventions and choices of instruments and that kind of thing, there's a very consistent voice as an artist that's very strong. I mean, you can spot Jerry's music. Once you know it, within 5 seconds, that's unmistakably Goldsmith. And that, to me, became the model. I loved the idea that genre is actually superficial, and I liken it to the clothes that I wear. Like, today I'm wearing this tie and a black shirt, and I look, you know, I'm threatening to look posh, if I dare borrow British language. But other days, it's just a t-shirt that's 15 years past when it should have been thrown out, and tennis shoes that have holes in them and that kind of thing. And the way I see it is that's genre. The clothes I'm wearing are not the same thing as the person wearing the clothes. And so, to me, the idea of being diverse or sort of chameleon in one's work is ultimately addressing the surface of what they're doing. It's not who they are on a deeper level. There are very few of my kind of film heroes still around. But Peter McConnell, for example, is one of my absolute all-time favorite composers. He did all of the LucasArts titles of the 90s, and the culmination of which is, for me, my probably favorite game score of all time, Grim Fandango. And he continues to be incredibly relevant in the industry. You know, one of the very few composers who got their start in the 80s and early 90s are still part of the actual forefront of the conversation today. I mean, that's just such an enduring career. It's hard in any medium to last that long. But, you know, he's the composer of Hearthstone and all the current, you know, Psychonauts 2, which is forthcoming, and everyone's always excited what Double Fine's up to, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so the fact that I get to call him not just a hero, but a good, close, personal friend is mind-boggling to me because I grew up listening to his music. And so for me, that's a selling point of the game industry. You know, your heroes work alongside you almost undoubtedly. The industry is still so young, it's populated by a lot of new voices, and there's people that I consider heroes of mine who are lateral heroes. I didn't look up to them as a kid, I look up to them from across the aisle, as it were, and of course, I make no, I don't hide at all that Jessica Curry is probably the chief amongst those. She's someone whose writing I have endless love for. And then she's a human being. We've spent some time together on multiple occasions, being able to look up to someone and then call them a colleague, and then being able to just look across and say, wow, you're brilliant. You actually make me be better because you're setting the bar like this. I mean, how could I have any self-respect and work alongside you and not give it my all, because otherwise you're just going to leave me in the dust here. The legends of film are from like the 30s and 40s. I mean, there are people that have been dead for half a century. Games, just not that way. I've seen all artists fall prey to this idea. There's this logical loop that forms where, hypothetically, I write a piece of music, and I struggle, and I pull my hair out, and I die for it, and then I put it out there, and people seem to like it, and they say, oh, this is a good piece of music. And then I make this logical equivocation. Good pieces of music must be written by good composers. Well, if I wrote this piece and the world has deemed it good, then by default, I must be a good composer. The problem is, when I then go to write the next piece of music, it's like this hand is writing a piece of music. Well, if this is a good composer writing this, then this must be a good piece of music. And I didn't go through all that struggle that made the first one potentially any good. And so by believing this notion that I am amazing, I actually create a very shortcut to mediocrity. I'm not a fan of this kind of false humility detachment. I'm very grateful that people have been so generous towards me, and like the BAFTAs as a perfect example. I've gotten noticed there multiple times, and every single time it's genuinely a privilege and it's an honor, and I'm always really grateful that that project is getting some notice, because by the time I finish something, I'm usually really passionate that that game get as much notice as possible. Never mind the score, I just want the game to get, and if the score can help further that, then that's great. Games are an unstoppable juggernaut. I think by the end of the 21st century, they will have clearly dominated as the primary kind of vehicle for cultural engagement and storytelling and that kind of thing, in the way that film is unquestionably the dominant voice of storytelling of the 20th century. So I don't think it's a matter of Of course, everybody that advocates for it, everybody that is out there evangelizing, much like yourselves at BAFTA, and even just self-starting communities out there of fans, basically, as much as all of that is so powerful and meaningful, I think games are selling themselves. I think that especially now that you can play games on a mobile device that everybody owns, and you can make really legitimate artistic titles. I mean, we were talking about Florence. Florence is a perfect example. That is a game that there is zero barrier to entry. You don't need a Nintendo or a PlayStation. And iPhones, Androids, those don't have the stigma for that increasingly small group of the population that thinks it's somehow weird to go buy a video game machine. But the beautiful thing is that sentence is increasingly out of date also. I mean, the idea of people who find it bizarre to go invest in a PlayStation, that's just a shrinking demographic. It just simply is. And so for me, games, they're on their way. There's no stopping them. Even if there are naysayers out there, they're not driving the conversation. I mean, people are creating increasingly personal, increasingly evocative, increasingly diverse types of content that applies to or appeals to all types of human beings. And it's only going to get more and more and more. I mean, it'd be like judging literature based on what was a contemporary of Beowulf. I mean, what on earth, that we're putting the cart before the horse a little bit, I think. And so, or judging film by what the biggest hits of 1931 were. You know, I mean, it's just the best is yet to come, for sure. My goal is certainly to look back on something like Journey in 10 or 15 years and laugh and be like, I can't believe we thought that was interesting. Look what's happening today. But I think that's going to happen regardless of if I want it to.